Well, in this fourth lecture, I want to start looking beyond the British Isles to consider the extent to which Scottish patrons and their masons began to show an increased awareness of what continental Europe had to offer in their search for new ideas. Of course, it just simply doesn't need stating in an audience of this kind that many of the ideas that underlay our earlier architecture had their ultimate origins in continental Europe. But of course, in most cases, the architectural evidence suggests that those ideas had reached Scotland through the medium of England. But this changed in the 14th century as borrowings from England evidently began to seem less and less attractive, and as political and cultural links with France became stronger, and commercial and artistic contacts with the Low Countries took on ever greater significance. But here I really do want to make the point that I don't think that Scottish patrons were ever going to seek to follow their continental neighbours to the extent of emulating all aspects of structural and decorative systems, in the way that had perhaps been the case in the earlier 12th century, when English buildings were the principal source of inspiration, and when it's likely that it was English masons who were carrying out the work, at least to start with. Scotland was certainly looking for new ideas for its architecture, but patrons and masons now increasingly seem to wish to create a synthesis of elements that would be specifically tailored to their own needs, and for which stimulus might be found in more than one source. And I want to start by considering some of the ideas that appear likely to have come from France, although having just discovered that there are some French people in the audience, I don't think I want to do it after all. Well, let's just remind ourselves of some of the contacts with France through the Old Alliance. It was, of course, in 1295, King John Balliol's signing of a treaty with Philip the Fair of France that led to Edward deposing him and the outbreak of what are known as the Wars of Independence. But there were going to be a whole series of treaties at regular intervals. In 1326, Robert I signed a treaty with Charles IV. In 1371, Robert II signed a treaty with Charles V. In 1424, very significant for some of the things that I'm going to be talking about later this afternoon, the Earl of Douglas was created Duke of Touraine, and in 1428 there was agreement on the marriage of Princess Margaret to the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne, and eventually, 8 years later, in 1436, Margaret did marry the Dauphin. Other items that perhaps, well, events that might perhaps just be mentioned in passing were, in 1513, Louis XII granted citizenship to all Scots resident in France, and in 1548, another Scottish aristocrat, the Earl of Arran, was granted a French dukedom, the Dukedom of Châtellerault. Just as a bit of wallpaper on this screen, I've got a picture that's supposed to show Princess Margaret of Scotland entering Tours for her marriage to the Dauphin in 1436, and I'll be saying a little bit more about that later on. Well, interest in what was happening in France was perhaps becoming a little more overt, even in the second quarter of the 14th century. And of course we know that Robert I chose to have his tomb made in Paris in 1329, and here are some of the fragments that are thought to be from that tomb. And there's a very nice paper by Ian Fraser on what can be found about that tomb. And of course I've already said that Scottish prelates had to travel through France very frequently when the papacy was in exile in Avignon. It was in 1309 that the papacy relocated from Rome to Avignon in what was known as the Babylonian captivity. And in 1378, there was the start of the Great Schism, when the antipope in Avignon was the head of the church that was supported by Scotland, along with France. That Great Schism only came to an end in 1417, but obviously an awful lot of French prelates must have been treading the path right down to the south of France, and must have known quite a lot of France en route. There are other things as well, of course. a lot of Scottish mercenaries fought in France in the course of the 100 Years' War. There's a painting of Scottish troops at Orleans in 1429. You can see the Scottish Royal Standard flying there. That's from a copy of Froissart's Chronicles. And Donald Watt's map in the Atlas of Scottish History has plotted many of the places in France, in northern France and western France, which would have been known by the troops who were fighting in the 100 Years' War. So, you know, there's a lot to indicate that quite a few Scottish people were well placed to know quite a lot of parts of France. And this becomes significant when we start looking at Melrose Abbey once again. Up here on the left, you've got the east gable of the Abbey Church, which I've said was started soon after it was destroyed by the forces of Richard II in 1385. And I pointed out that this first part of the building has a lot of very English features in them, and most obviously of all, this rectilinear tracery here. Well, this is the south transept gable. I showed you the head of the gable earlier on. I'm fairly sure that this, the shell of the south transept was built along with the presbytery at its east gable as part of the same campaign. But I'm sure you've all spotted that the window tracery is very different indeed from what you see in the east gable, which is why I blotted it out when I showed it to you earlier. I didn't want you to be getting ideas above your station at an early stage. Well, why is this tracery so very different from the tracery that we've got in the east gable? Well, there are a number of possibilities, probably two main possibilities. This is the sort of tracery that had well, tracery with these double ogee curves in it was the sort of tracery that there'd been in England before this rectilinear tracery came into fashion. So is it possible that whoever designed that window was looking back to early 14th century window tracery and deciding he liked it and copying it? It's certainly a possibility. But the other possibility is that it was in fact designed by a continental mason, because these ideas, having been rejected in England, were later taken up on the continent and developed in wholly new ways, eventually, of course, leading to the extraordinary richnesses of flamboyant tracery. Well, mercifully, at Melrose, we really don't have to wait long for an answer to this question, because in the south transept there are two inserted inscriptions, one on a tablet just there, and one cut into the lintel and the north jamb of this doorway just here, which tell us about the master mason who was responsible for this work. And he tells us that his name was John Morow, and he says that he was born in Paris, and that already by the time that he put this inscription up at Melrose, he'd worked at St Andrews, at Glasgow, obviously at Melrose because he's working there still, at Paisley, at what he calls Nidisdale, which is obviously Nithsdale, and is almost certainly Lincluden, which is in Nithsdale, and also Galloway, which was the diocese of Whithorn. So here we have an extraordinarily important inscription which tells us that we do actually have a French mason at work here. Well, how far can we identify the work of a French mason? Well, I think one of the first things that points to the presence of somebody, well, certainly from the continent, not necessarily from France, is the addition of this row of chapels along the south side of the nave. Now, it wasn't altogether unknown, of course, to add chapels along the length of buildings, usually in a piecemeal fashion, though not in a single operation like this. And at Elgin, in fact, after the 1270 campaign, outer aisles were added on both sides of the cathedral. So, you know, there's a post-1270 precedent for doing that in Scotland. But I think what we're looking at here is something rather different. These are the chapels on the plan, and here you can see the earliest of them actually on the building itself. But that sort of row of chapels just simply on the side of the church away from the cloister where you didn't have to disturb the life in the cloister or require major rebuilding of the cloister, is something that you find pretty much across the whole of Europe in a whole series of Cistercian abbey churches. And just as a comparison, not a particularly revealing one, I put up a plan of the Abbey of Fawcett in southern France, where you can see here how the chapels have been added just on this one side away from the cloister. And I could in fact show you examples of this sort of addition of single aisles pretty much across the whole of Europe, right from Spain to the Czech Republic. But obviously here at Melrose we do actually have the name of a French mason who very proudly proclaims that he was born in Paris. Well, can we actually see his hand in any of the details? I personally think that we can see his hand very clearly indeed, and I think we see it most clearly of all in these two chapels just here, and these are the two windows of those chapels. And what we have in these windows is a very elegant combination of flowing forms and what used to be called spherical figures. It's now thought more proper to refer to them as bowed figures, because of course they're not spherical. I still don't see any reason why they shouldn't be called spherical figures. But this combination that you get in this window here, these very restrained flowing forms and the spherical figures, does really correspond to a fairly short phase of tracery design in France that we can actually pin down quite tightly. But the rather nice thing about those two windows is that we can also find one of them at two of the other churches that John Morow said that he was involved in the construction of, and that's Lincluden, or Nidisdale as he gave it in his list, and Paisley, which he gave as Paisley. It doesn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination to see Paisley as Paisley. But look at that window just there. I'm afraid I'm calling on your imagination quite a lot in looking at windows, I know. But the middle window on each side at Lincluden is also exactly the same form. And these are details of the windows. And if you look very carefully, you see there's a very slight difference at Lincluden, where this dagger form or mouchette turns up at the edges rather than goes down, but otherwise the windows were pretty much identical. And the extraordinary thing is it's not just the windows that are identical, but it's also these mouldings that frame the windows with this very gentle, unbroken curve framing the window, which isolates the window from the wall in a very attractive way indeed. But that's something that we get in all three of those churches. And those are the only churches, the only three churches, where we have windows with that tracery and with those mouldings framing them. So, you know, it really does look like the work of the same mason. And you know, where can we look for windows in France that have this sort of tracery? Most of the ones in France are on a rather larger scale. And of course, the 100 Years' War in France was meaning that there wasn't actually an awful lot of building going on at the right sort of period. You know, I'm afraid the English were making life as miserable for would-be builders of French churches, just as miserable as they had been for would-be builders of churches in Scotland. But if we look at something like the de la Grange chapel at Amiens Cathedral, added on the outside of the nave, as I say, a much larger window, but we do have so many of the elements that we see in these windows here, there as well. You know, look at this circlet with the three bowed triangles in them. It's like what we've got just there. The way we have this combination of bowed figures and gently curving daggers or mouchettes in the window head. It is still very much this. It is very much the same sort of idiom. And there are one or two other buildings where you can find the same details. And I dragged my wife off to Vincennes for one of our wedding anniversaries and nearly died of shock as I came out of the metro station and in a case there saw a corbel which I would have sworn had come from Melrose Abbey. So we spent most of our wedding anniversary at Vincennes crawling around it. But the chateau was rebuilt mainly for Jean II and Charles V between 1361 and about 1405. And just looking at these pictures, you'll not see too much in common with what I've been showing you in Scotland. But if you look at, say, this window of the corridor leading to the sacristy, here you've got a bowed triangle with 3 bowed triangles set inside it. It's not a circlet like that, but it's a very similar sort of idiom. And again, this predominant use of the bowed figures in the windows of the chapel itself. But I'll come and have a look at some other details of Vincennes in a second, but just want to go back to Lincluden and Paisley, because we can see 2 other windows in these 2 churches that are probably the work of John Morow. Here at Paisley, the window survives in a rather mucked around state. I don't know if you can see, but there is just the stump of a mullion just there. And if you look very closely and half close your eyes and sort of look over your shoulder, you can probably just about see the ghost of the base of the stump of a mullion just there. So these lights were obviously subdivided, as you'd expect such enormous lights to be. And when you look at the details, obviously it was very much the same as this window here at Lincluden Collegiate Church in the south transept. And I've attempted a very rough sketch, which really should not have been enlarged to the extent that it has, showing just what that window in each case must have looked like. Here at Paisley, of course, we've got this characteristic moulding framing the window, the very gentle curve. In the south transept at Lincluden, we don't. We did have it in the choir, as I showed you, but for some reason in the south transept we don't. But you know, it is the same window, and it's the same person at work, so I think we can be fairly sure it's John Morow. But there are other details as well. A detail that you find in several places at Melrose, mainly where it's been inserted, is this crouching figure corbel holding a scroll with a suitably improving text on it. Well, that sort of crouching figure corbel is something that becomes very common in the later Middle Ages in Europe, but I couldn't, for the life of me, think of examples that were the right sort of date for comparison with Melrose. And this is where my sort of catharsis on leaving the metro station at Vincennes was so important, because it was a corbel like these that I saw in the glass case. And as you go around the castle at Vincennes, in the donjon, in the chapel, in some of the gates into the chateau, you have just so many of these crouching figure corbels. Now, obviously, they're not carved by the same sculptor. I wouldn't want to go as far as that. But the creative mind behind these corbels was, I think, showing a fair kinship to the creative mind that was creating this corbel here at Melrose. And we can see other examples. In fact, the only other examples that I can think of in Scotland, there are 2 at Glasgow Cathedral that have come from the demolished Western Towers. And you remember that the Glasgow is referred to as the High Kirk of Glasgow on Melrose's inscription. On Morrow's inscription at Melrose. So this is presumably Morrow's work there as well, this and the other crouching figure corbel. And we also have one at Lincluden. Now that may look to you like a carving of a cumulonimbus cloud, and it certainly does on this picture here, but if you look very closely, there has been a head there, and there is a scroll that's being held there. So you know, we really do have quite a lot in common between all of these churches. That points very strongly to our being able to identify the figure of John Morow there. And as I say, his inscription says he was born in Paris, and I think it must be seen as at least a possibility that it was at Vincennes, on the outskirts of Paris, that he learned his trade. Well, how did he get to Scotland? I suppose I might have got on the wrong metro station in the morning. But I think there's one person who really has an awful lot to do with several of the buildings that Moreau is known to have been involved in, and that's the 4th Earl of Douglas. And I wouldn't like to stress this too far, but I do think it is a real possibility that it could have been the 4th Earl of Douglas who brought him back to Scotland with him. The 4th Earl succeeded to the earldom in 1400 after his father, the 3rd Earl, died on Christmas Day, wasn't it, that he died. He was an enormously powerful individual, and he was married to a daughter of Robert III, Princess Margaret. And as I've said, towards the end of his life, in gratitude for all the help that he gave to the French, in leading the Scottish forces, he was created Duke of Touraine. And that really is a quite extraordinary honour at that phase, because as far as I'm aware, dukedoms were reserved for princes of the blood royal. So, you know, we're looking at a very, very important person indeed, both in Scotland and in England. But there are various people who were in his household at various times. There was somebody rejoicing in the name of Aloysius Adagon, who was a member of his household, who went on in 1390 to be Provost of Lincluden, and in 1406 he was elevated to the bishopric of Galloway, that's the Cathedral of Whithorn. Another person who was in the Earl's household was John Cameron. He was secretary to his son from 1422. He became Provost of Lincluden, following on from Aloysius Adagon in 1425. And he became Bishop of Glasgow in 1426. All of these buildings at which Moreau is known to have worked. And then we can go on from that. Although Lincluden had been founded by Archibald, the third Earl of Douglas, he lost interest in it and spent all his time at Bothwell Church. And it was stated in an account that it was unfinished in 1406. And the person who did most of the building there was in fact the Countess of the fourth Earl, Princess Margaret, the daughter of Robert III. So there is a connection with the fourth Earl, with Lincluden, in all these ways. And beyond that, we know that in 1424, the Earl and his Countess endowed a chapel at Whithorn. Was that the chapel that John Morow was working on? And of course, we also know that Douglas was the protector of Melrose, where the first and second Earls of Douglas were buried. So it does seem to be that there is such an extraordinary range of connections with the churches that were built by John Morow, such an extraordinary series of connections with the fourth Earl of Douglas, that it does seem to me that there's at least a case to answer that it could have been the Earl who brought John Morow back from France on one of his shopping expeditions and put him to work on several of the buildings in which he had an interest. Well, how much impact could Moreau have had? It's difficult to go too far in seeing too much immediately traceable impact of Morrow's work, but I think he may have come over with a team of other workmen who were working in a slightly different French idiom. At Melrose Abbey, for example, the window on the north side of the presbytery, which is unlike all of the other presbytery windows. All of the other presbytery windows have this rectilinear tracery. This is the only one that has a flowing tracery. And I think, rather like the window that I showed you at Glasgow earlier on, this is a window that was perhaps left open to allow materials to be brought in, because the way into the presbytery would have been blocked until the presbytery of the original church was removed. So I think tracery was only put in this window at a quite late stage. And I do wonder, with this very elegant flowing tracery, it's a stage on from the sort of tracery that we've been looking at in Morrow's work, but could it have been by somebody who was working with Moreau? The same for the very elegant window that was inserted in the west front of Brecon Cathedral, for which we don't have any date, but I think if you compare the two windows there, you'll see that there are quite a lot of similarities between them. We have these, well, here it's a quatrefoil dagger in the sub-arches, there it's a straightforward dagger. But you know, the arrangement of motifs up here isn't all that different from those. And I think when we look at some of the later windows in Vincennes again, if you look at the interlocking figures that we have within these ogee arched sub-arches there, yeah, it's not a million miles from the sort of tracery that we're looking there. So, you know, is it possible that Moreau did bring other people across with him and they went on to work at other places? I think there is a real possibility there. Well, if we're talking about France, I don't think we have any alternative but to talk about Rosslyn. I always worry in talking about Rosslyn because it's an absolutely wonderful building, but it does seem to attract some rather extraordinary theories. And I remember once being asked to give a talk on Rosslyn, and I said very loftily that no, I didn't give talks on Rosslyn, but they pointed out that there was a very handsome fee attached to it, and I decided I probably did have a duty to try to put my ideas across. But if you try to describe Roslin, you could almost sound as if you were describing an early Cistercian French abbey church. And as you know, the Cistercians were a very austere order who favoured very simplified architecture in their earlier days, at least. But what you'd have to say in describing Roslin was that the eastern limb, which was the only part that was to be built, had an aisle down each side. It had an eastern ambulatory returned at the east end with a row of chapels beyond it. And if you were describing the interior, you would say that the aisles were covered by transverse barrel vaults and that the central vessel itself was covered by a longitudinal barrel vault. Well, let's have a look at those individual elements. Probably the earliest example of this sort of east end was at Moreau, Cistercian Abbey in France of about 1160. Here you can see there's the ambulatory with the chapels at the east end. Here also chapels down the flanks as well. Not sure if those are original or not. This sort of plan was then taken up in the Cistercian Abbey church in England, Abbey Dore in Herefordshire in about 1186. You know, there's the ambulatory, the eastern chapels. May have been, Christopher Wilson suggested it was taken up at Newbattle in Midlothian, and I'm certainly very attracted to the idea because these large piers here might suggest there was a return wall just there. And then in the 1240s probably, it was taken up at Glasgow Cathedral as a way of combining a choir, a presbytery, a feretory, and a lot of additional chapels. And then, of course, you go on from there to Roslin. So, all right, it's a type of plan that originates with the Cistercians, but there are non-Cistercian precedents in Scotland, like Glasgow Cathedral, that could have been copied. Well, let's go along and have a look at the interior. Here's a picture of the interior. There are the laterally aligned pointed barrel vaults over the aisles, very much like what we can see at Fontenay, Cistercian Abbey in France. Just about the earliest Cistercian Abbey surviving in France. Probably started about 1139, although the date is being looked at again at the moment. So there are the laterally aligned vaults over the aisles, and there's the high-pointed barrel vault over the main space, you know, pretty much as we've got at Fontenay, although here there is a clear story. So, you know, if you close your eyes and try very hard not to think of Roslin, when you hear it described, you can almost think of it in these early Cistercian terms. But, you know, we've seen the plan already has precedents in Scotland, at Glasgow, and that's probably also true for the forms of the vaulting. This is a sketch that I had made of the first church at Melrose, of which we have very little indeed, very, very little indeed. But you'll see I had transverse barrel vaults shown over the aisles here, and that's because the church here was based very closely on the church at Rievaulx in North Yorkshire, which we do know did have the transverse barrel vaults. So it may be that there was a memory of the Cistercian arrangement of transverse barrel vaults here at Melrose, although of course Melrose itself was at least partly rebuilt by this stage, but I do think the nave probably still survived up to this stage. And of course, I've already shown you in the previous lecture that we have lots and lots of precedents for the pointed barrel vault with parallel ribs going down its full length. So when you become aware of those things, obviously, rather mercifully, Roslin begins to sound rather less Cistercian than it might. So is there anything French left in Roslin? Well, I think there just could be. Because this extraordinary richness of detailing, heaven knows where they got the idea for these pendants sticking out at the oddest angles that you can imagine from the tas de charge of the vaulting, but all of this drop cusping everywhere. I do just wonder if it is possible that the idea could have come from something like Tours Cathedral, where the west front was started in 1427, and where in the early stages of the development of flamboyant architecture, you did get almost a similar degree of richness. It's much more controlled, much more restrained to Tours. But of course, the thing that we have to remember here is that Roslin had, of course, been built for William, Earl of Caithness and Orkney, And it was William who led the party of Princess Margaret of Scotland to tour for her marriage to the Dauphin in 1436. So the Earl would have been aware of this new approach to richness of detail that you get in something like Tour, and it may be that it was seeing that sort of richness of effect that he was wanting to emulate at Roslin. I really don't know. I have to say, when you look at Roslin closely, you do end up sticking straws in your hair fairly quickly, and there really can be no certainty in any interpretation at all. But I just offer that as one possible line of inquiry. I think we're on rather firmer. Oh yes, I should have shown you that picture, of course, of Princess Margaret entering Tours for her marriage in 1436. And there is a general view of the west front of the cathedral at Tours, which had been started shortly before the entry of the princess into Tours. Well, let's go on to slightly less speculative ground. Still quite speculative, it has to be said. The College of St Salvator in St Andrews. This was founded by Bishop James Kennedy in 1450, and it was ready for dedication in 1460. It's a building that's been very much altered. None of the window tracery is original, and the pinnacles going along the south face and around the apse have all been replaced. Quite a few interesting details, though. The reveals of the windows do have some similarities with the reveals that we've been seeing in the work of John Morow. But the really striking thing about this church is the plan of it. It's basically a rectangle with a polygonal eastern apse as the backdrop to the high altar. Well, of course, a lot of Scottish churches had apsidal terminations in the 12th century. They've been rounded apses, of course, but they passed out of fashion, well, certainly by the later 12th century. And as far as I'm aware, this polygonal eastern apse at St Salvator's College is the first example of this type of apse that we have in Scotland. And I think it is very significant for that. And I think what we have to remember with Bishop James Kennedy is that he was an extremely cosmopolitan individual. He'd been educated at the University of Leuven or Louvain, whichever you want it to be. He was high in the councils of the king and involved in many embassies. Very importantly, he had a kinsman who was very highly placed in the University of Paris, and so he must have known the University of Paris quite well. And I think this comes out in the fact that the statutes of the University of Paris figure quite prominently in the statutes that he drew up for St Salvator's College, along with those of Orleans and Oxford and some others as well. But I think really what you have to bear in mind is the possibility that in going for this sort of plan, the elongated chapel with the polygonal eastern apse, it's looking to a very long French tradition of that sort of chapel. This is the Archbishop's Chapel at Reims, dating from about 1235 to the southeast of the cathedral there. And here, of course, is the most famous example of the lot, the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris of about 1242 to 8, which is almost impossible to photograph because you can't get far enough away from it to take a full-on view. And at the moment it's swathed in scaffolding. Obviously the word got out that I was going there, and they got it up before I got there. But these chapels are of a rather particular type. These are two-storied chapels. And where you have these two-storied chapels, it's because the upper chapel was the main chapel and was for the owner and his household, whereas the lower chapel was for lesser members of the household. Well, that, of course, isn't what's been copied here at St Salvator's, but I think it's very possible that what was being copied was one of the chapels in the University of Paris. Only one of them survives, and I think it's now a Russian Orthodox church, and they won't let you take photographs of it. But there are views of the chapel that was attached to the college that was founded for the Abbey of Cluny in the university. It was built about 1269, and this is a drawing of it before it was destroyed. And it's quite a bit shorter than the chapel at St Salvator's, but its basic design, I hope you'll agree, does show quite a lot in common with the sort of approach that we're seeing at St Salvator's. And I think, bearing in mind that Kennedy did have a well-placed kinsman at the university, I think he may well have been looking at something like that. But for me, the real selling point is the amazing mace that was made for the college for Bishop Kennedy in 1461. And this was made by Jean Morow, who was warden of the Paris goldsmiths in 1455, 1460, and 1467, and who was in fact goldsmith to the Dauphin. This is the absolute tops of goldsmiths in Europe, and there's no doubt that this is one of the great outstanding pieces of goldsmiths' work to survive in Europe. There aren't too many things that we have that you can say that about, but that is certainly the case for this. And I think a patron who was prepared to go to such lengths in having his mace made, it's not inconsistent to see him as drawing his designs from Paris as well. So, no, there's no certainty about it, of course there isn't, but I do think there is a real possibility there. Well, that's how probably the first example of an unaisled building with an eastern apse. And I think probably the first aisled building with an eastern apse was Trinity College Chapel in Edinburgh. Of course, we're in great trouble here because it was demolished in 1848 to allow for the expansion of Waverley Station, which never in fact happened. And then it was eventually reconstructed in a rather garbled way in 1872 as part of a larger church, which has since been demolished. But this is what survives here now. It's now just simply a museum store. And you'll see that the arcades are filled in with walls with windows in them. But we do have the engraving by Robert William Billings, which I think shows it fairly accurately. Billings could be quite naughty in putting in details for which there was no justification, but I think all the evidence is that he got it right with this. And I think the one thing that's certain is that this was a very fine piece of architecture indeed. Well, it was built really as what I suppose you could almost call a chantry for King James II, who was killed at the siege of Roxburgh Castle when a cannon burst. He rather forgot that in the early days of artillery, it was probably safer to stand in front of a cannon when it was being fired rather than standing behind it. And the college was really established by his queen, Mary of Guelders, where masses could be said for his salvation. And we have to remember that Mary of Guelders, she was the daughter of the Duke of Guelders, but she was brought up at the court of her great aunt, Isabel of Portugal, the Duchess of Burgundy, a very highly educated woman with an itinerant court. And while living in her great aunt's court, she would have seen a great deal of architecture that was going up under the aegis of the court of Burgundy. And one that I find particularly interesting is a small priory church at Ambiel, which was started in about 1440. I'll say in a later lecture something about this altar retable that there is there that's rather interesting. But I think in Ambiel, I'm not suggesting it is the direct source for Trinity College Chapel, but I think in Ambiel, if we look at this, we can see a lot of details that help us to understand why Trinity College must have been such a really consummate piece of work. The way in which the eastern apse grows out of the aisled section of the nave is handled extraordinarily competently. I'll be showing you some examples, I think it's in the final lecture if you last so long, showing a number of cases where apses were put on the east end of aisled buildings, and the phrase pig's ear rather springs to mind. But this was superbly handled. And the proportions of the church, the way in which it's divided into two more or less equal portions in height, the arcade obviously occupying the lower part, then a very tall clerestory, with the TS1 vault rising at a fairly high point within the clerestory. Quite interesting. In a lot of the churches we've seen so far, you really do get the feeling that the masons were trying very hard to reduce the impact of the wall. The wall was being voided as far as it possibly could be by the size of the arches and the size of windows, which were stretched to a great width. They were wanting to give the sense that the walls were no longer really heavy. But here at Edinburgh Trinity College, you did have a new interest in the surfaces of the wall. But it wasn't an interest that expressed the weight of the wall, it was simply the planes of the wall. That's probably sounding over complex, but I do think you get an awful lot of this also in something like Ambiel. And bearing in mind that Ambiel was built very much under the eye of the Burgundian court. It's in Burgundy, not far from Dijon. I do think it is possible that it was something like this that explains why Edinburgh Trinity College was such a particularly fine piece of work. And of course, let's remember that the pattern of high patronage of Trinity College continued in the 1470s when the altar reservoir was commissioned from Van der Goes. And of course it's now in the National Gallery. Well, I'm very cross about that. Usually when you go into the National Gallery, you can ask them to move the wings so that you can see both sides of it. But I thought I'd go in and refresh my soul by having a look at it yesterday. And they're refusing to move it at the moment. So if everybody goes along and demands to have it moved, perhaps we might get somewhere with it. So I think what we have here is an aisleless apse building, an aisled apse building, both of which I think we can see having their ultimate origins in France, although probably built by Scottish masons under the direction of a French master mason, perhaps. Another building where I think it's very attractive to think that there may have been a French mason work is at the borough church of Linlithgow St Michael. This is the south transeptal chapel. There's the south transeptal chapel just there, and there's the window in it, which is really quite extraordinary piece of work. All of the windows in the nave, in fact, are very elegant indeed, but this is really something altogether different. And it's interesting that the terminus antiquem that we have for the completion of the nave is the death and burial of a mason called John French, who died in 1489, who'd apparently been working on the palace next door to the parish church. Well, John French was actually the first of quite a dynasty of masons, some of the later ones of whom were also going to be working on Linlithgow St Michael. But is it really too much of a stretch of the imagination to wonder if that name may have indicated his origin, that he was actually French? The Scottish kings did rather collect French masons. James V was probably the one who did it most avidly. One of his wedding presents from his mother-in-law, the wife of Marie de Guise-Lorraine, was a pair of masons, and I've often slightly wondered if he meant to breed from them, but I've never been quite sure about that. But this sort of tracery, I think you'll agree, is very French indeed. And the date is just about right, because we can compare it with a window at Dunkeld Cathedral. You'll instantly spot, of course, that that window there was precisely the same as that, except that it had arched heads to the lights. And there we know that Bishop Thomas Lauder started this tower in 1469, and it was Bishop James Levington, who died in 1483, who completed it, because his arms are close to the wall head. And this window must have been put in at the same time that that tower was started. So that would tie in with the date of a little before 1489 for the window at Linlithgow as well. Well, if it is French, how French is it? Well, the nearest comparisons that I can see, I hope this doesn't sound too much like a game of train spotting, it probably does, but the nearest parallels that I can find are in eastern France, in the Viennois and Lyonnais area. Now, there are several windows in that area where I think we have a very, very similar approach to design. If you look at the west front of Bienne, here you have these circlets. It's made up of a series of circlets, and the pattern of the figures inside those circlets isn't exactly the same, but it really is quite similar. There is quite a strong family resemblance. We see something really quite similar as well in this circular window at Lyon Cathedral. You can also see rather similar tracery on a smaller scale in the west front of Ambiel Priory, which was the one that I showed you when I was trying to make a comparison for the design of Trinity College in Edinburgh. So, I find it very difficult to imagine where the idea for this window and the window at Dunkeld could have come from if it hadn't have come from something like that. So, I do think there is a real possibility that the French, John French, the mason who was buried in the church in 1489, his origins really could be indicated by his name. Well, I want to end this lecture by looking at a couple of slides of one last very fragmentary building. We're going back to St Andrews, this time looking at St Mary's College, which was founded in about 1537 by Archbishop James Beaton. It was on the site of the pedagogy, the nucleus of the first university at St Andrews, founded in about 1430. The chapel was probably never finished. I think it may be this building that's shown on John Geddes' view of about 1580 that's now in the National Library of Scotland. I come up with different views every time I look at this little vignette, because it's a tiny little vignette, very much enlarged here. But this does actually look like an unfinished building with diagonal buttresses at the corners. But there are a number of fragments that are thought to have come from the chapel and the other buildings that are built around the courtyard on the inner side of Parliament Hall and St Mary's College. And this is one of them. And when you look at it, it's perhaps nothing too very startling. It's obviously not work of the absolute highest standard. But what you've got on this shield here is what's known as the Arma Christi, the Arms of Christ. And in this case, there are various versions of the Arma Christi, but this is the one that has the 5 wounds, the 2 hands, the heart, and 2 slightly improbable-looking feet there at the bottom. But the thing that really interests me about this corbel is that the shield is supported by a pair of putti, or amorini. Now, it had been quite common in Scotland to have coats of arms supported by angels. Angels have a good medieval ancestry. But having these putti or amorini is really a very Renaissance element. And we do know that French masons did advise Cardinal Beaton on the building of St Mary's College, including a later member of the French dynasty, in this case Thomas French. And you'll probably laugh me to scorn when I put this next picture up, so I think perhaps I'll not put it up after all. But this is just a picture of the tomb of the children of Charles VIII, made in 1499. It's in Tours Cathedral. It was made by an Italian, Girolamo da Fiesole and Michel Colombe. It sounds like it was an Italian mason who was advising a French mason. And here, I think you'll be able to see 2 putti or amorini supporting the shield on the side of the tomb. I wouldn't question for an instant that these putti are carved perhaps rather more satisfactorily than the putti on the shield at St Mary's. But I think it was certainly something of this kind that must have been looked at when this corbel was carved. And I've already said that Thomas French was advising Cardinal Beaton on the building of the college. And we also know, of course, that Cardinal Beaton himself travelled very extensively in France. He was certainly there in 1533, in 1534, 1536, 1537, 1538 and 1541. You sort of have a vision of him packing up his swimming trunks and bucket and spade every year, getting ready to head off. But he was somebody who was well acquainted with what was possible in France. And I think this is probably the Scotticized consequence of looking to something like this. And actually, this is one of the first pieces, one of the first fragments from a Scottish church in which you really see overt classical Renaissance elements coming through. Sorry about the Cistercians, I've rather got them on my mind. Anyway, that's really as much as I have to say about looking to France for these, for our Scottish churches. And first thing tomorrow, I'll be starting to look at the Low Countries. So thank you very much.